Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The liar paradox. There exists a statement so simple that it collapses the foundations of truth itself. A sentence that devours its own meaning the moment it is spoken. And this is the liar paradox, a loop that has haunted logicians and philosophers for over 2,000 years. The paradox is most famously expressed in a single declaration. This statement is false, and the mind recoils at what follows. For if the statement is true, then it must be false as it claims. But if it is false, then it must be true because it correctly identifies itself as false. And so the cycle begins again, spiraling endlessly, without resolution, without escape. The ancient Greeks were the first to wrestle with this demon of language, and Epimenides, the Cretan, is often credited with an early version when he declared that all Cretans are liars, which implies that if he himself is a Cretan, then his statement must be a lie, which means Cretans might actually tell the truth, which means his statement might be true, which means it is false again, and the contradiction churns without mercy. Philosophers have spent centuries trying to solve or dissolve the paradox, and some argue that self-referential statements like this are simply meaningless, that language breaks down when it tries to refer to itself in this way, while others suggest that truth is not binary, but exists on a spectrum, allowing for statements that are neither fully true nor fully false, hovering in some undefined space between. Bertrand Russell encountered similar contradictions when developing set theory and discovered that self-reference could destroy the entire logical framework of mathematics, leading him to create new systems that carefully excluded paradoxes like the liar from ever forming. The paradox also influenced Kurt Gödel, whose incompleteness theorems proved that within any sufficiently complex logical system, there will always be true statements that cannot be proven, which itself echoes the spirit of the liar paradox, the idea that truth and provability are not always the same thing. Some modern logicians have proposed paraconsistent logics, systems where contradictions can exist without causing the entire structure to collapse, allowing the liar paradox to be true and false simultaneously without forcing us to accept that everything is true, which would render logic useless. Others reject the paradox entirely, claiming that natural language is too vague and imprecise to support rigorous logical analysis, that the liar paradox is a quirk of grammar rather than a deep philosophical problem. Yet the paradox persists, refusing to die, surfacing in new forms, across disciplines, from computer science to legal theory, anywhere that self-reference appears. Consider a sign that reads, "Ignore this sign," or a rule that states there are no rules, or a person who says everything I say is a lie, and the same strange loop emerges, the same dizzying collapse of meaning. The liar paradox forces confrontation with the limits of language, logic, and truth itself, suggesting that reality may not always fit neatly into categories of true and false, that some truths may be inherently unstable, slipping through the fingers the moment they're grasped. It reminds us that words are not perfect mirrors of reality, but tools shaped by human thought, and sometimes those tools turn on themselves, revealing cracks in the structures we build to make sense of existence. The McGurk effect. Why seeing changes what you hear. A person watches a video of someone speaking, sees their lips move, hears sounds, and perceives speech, but something strange occurs. The auditory signal says one thing, the syllable "baha," and the visual signal shows lips making a different movement, the movement for ga, and yet what the person hears is neither ba nor ga, but da, a fusion of the two inputs, a compromise between hearing and vision. And this is the McGurk effect, discovered by psychologist Harry McGurk in 1976, a robust illusion showing that speech perception is multimodal, integrates auditory and visual information. And vision can alter what you hear, can change the perceived phoneme, even though the auditory input remains constant and the effect is automatic, is unconscious, occurs even when you know it is happening, and closing your eyes restores the original bar sound, showing that vision was modifying auditory perception. And the McGurk effect reveals that perception is not modality specific, but is multimodal, that different senses interact, that seeing influences hearing and hearing influences seeing, and perception is a unified process that integrates information from multiple sources. And this has implications for theories of perception, for understanding consciousness, and for recognizing that sensory modalities are not separate channels, but are interconnected systems that jointly construct perceptual experience. Imagine experiencing the effect, watching a video where someone's lips move saying "gar" while the audio plays "bar," and you hear "da," not what was said, not what the lips showed, but a fusion, and you know the audio is "bear," can check by closing your eyes, but when your eyes are open you hear "da." Vision overrides audition, changes what you hear, and the effect is involuntary, is not something you can turn off. Perception integrates the inputs automatically, and this integration occurs before consciousness, before you become aware of the sound, and what reaches awareness is already a fusion, already combines hearing and seeing, and you cannot access the separate inputs, cannot hear bay and see gay separately, but only experience the integrated da. The McGurk effect demonstrates that speech perception is not purely auditory, not simply a matter of processing sound waves, but involves visual information about lip movements, facial gestures, speaker identity, and context. And the brain combines these sources, weighs them according to reliability, and produces a unified percept. And when visual and auditory information conflict, the brain compromises, produces a perception that splits the difference. And this compromise shows that perception is not just input-driven but is constructed, is the result of unconscious inference, of combining cues according to probabilities. And McGurk is an example where the inference goes wrong, produces a percept that does not match either input perfectly, but represents the brain's best guess given conflicting information. Visualize the perceptual system as Bayesian, as computing probabilities based on sensory inputs and prior expectations. And when you see lips saying "gyar" and hear "br," the brain computes that "die" is most likely given that visual and auditory cues are both somewhat unreliable and the percept should compromise between them. And this Bayesian integration explains many perceptual phenomena, explains how the brain combines cues from different senses, weights them by reliability, and produces unified, coherent experience. And the McGurk effect is a case where the integration produces an incorrect result, but reveals the normal processing that usually works well, that usually integrates senses accurately. The McGurk effect challenges theories that treat senses as separate, that analyze vision separately from audition, that assume perception is modality specific, and the effect shows that modalities interact. That perception is fundamentally multimodal, and this has led to theories of multisensory integration, to research on how the brain combines information from different senses, where in the brain this integration occurs, and what rules govern it. And the McGurk effect has become a paradigm case, a standard demonstration of multimodal perception used in countless psychology classes and research studies. The effect also has implications for understanding consciousness, because the fusion occurs before consciousness, occurs in processing that we do not have access to, and what we experience as the result of this processing is the fused percept, and we do not experience the separate auditory and visual inputs, do not have access to the processing that combined them, and consciousness receives only the output, only the unified percept, and this shows that much of perception is unconscious, is hidden from awareness, and conscious experience is constructed from unconscious processing. And the construction is so seamless that we do not notice it, do not realize that our experience is a synthesis rather than a direct recording of input. The McGurk effect appears in discussions of cognitive penetrability, because if perception is modular, if sensory systems are encapsulated, then one modality should not influence another. Vision should not alter what you hear, but the McGurk effect shows cross-modal influence, shows that perception is not strictly modular, that different sensory modules communicate and interact. And this qualifies strong modularity, suggests that while early sensory processing may be modular, later perceptual processing integrates across modalities, and perception as a whole is not modular but is interactive. And the McGurk effect is evidence for this interactivity, for perceptual systems that are not strictly separated but are interconnected. The effect also has practical implications for understanding speech perception in noisy environments, for designing hearing aids that take advantage of visual information, for developing virtual reality systems that create convincing multimodal experiences, and for understanding how perception can be manipulated, how illusions can be created through conflicting sensory cues. And the McGurk effect shows that perception is vulnerable to these manipulations, is not simply determined by physical input, but depends on how inputs are integrated. The person watches the video, hears da, knows the audio says ba, sees the lips say ga, and yet perceives da, a fusion that is none of the inputs but is the brain's compromise. And the McGurk effect persists, demonstrates multimodal integration, challenges modular theories, reveals unconscious perceptual processing, and stands as one of the most famous demonstrations in cognitive psychology. A simple effect that reveals deep truths about how perception works, how senses interact, how consciousness is constructed from unconscious processes, and the effect remains robust and automatic, a permanent feature of human speech perception, showing that seeing changes, hearing, that perception is unified, that the brain constructs experience from multiple sources, and the fusion continues. Da heard when ba was spoken, and ga was seen, and the McGurk effect endures. The omniscience paradox. Can God know what it's like to not know everything? A theologian declares that God is omniscient, all-knowing, possessing complete and perfect knowledge of everything that can be known, every fact, every truth, every possibility, past, present, and future. And this claim seems straightforward, seems like a natural attribute of a perfect being, and yet a puzzle emerges when we consider what omniscience includes, whether it encompasses not just propositional knowledge, facts that can be stated as true or false, but also experiential knowledge, the knowledge of what something feels like, what it is like to undergo certain experiences. And the paradox asks whether God knows what it is like to not know something, whether God understands the experience of ignorance, confusion, discovery, learning, and if God does know what ignorance feels like, then God must have experienced ignorance. But if God has experienced ignorance, then God was not always omniscient, and if God cannot know what ignorance feels like, then there is something God does not know. And either way, omniscience seems incomplete, seems to have gaps, and this is the omniscience paradox, a puzzle about whether complete knowledge includes knowledge of incomplete knowledge, whether knowing everything includes knowing what it is like to not know. Imagine God trying to understand human experience, trying to grasp what it feels like to be confused, to search for answers, to wonder whether something is true, to make mistakes, to learn, to have that moment of insight when understanding suddenly clicks into place after struggling. And these experiences seem to require not knowing, seem to be essentially experiences of ignorance or partial knowledge. And if God has never been ignorant, has always known everything, then God has never had these experiences, has never felt what it is like to learn. And so there is an aspect of human experience that God cannot fully understand, cannot know from the inside, and this suggests that Omniscience, defined as knowing everything, is actually impossible, because knowing everything includes knowing what it is like to not know everything. And these two forms of knowledge are incompatible, cannot both be had by the same being at the same time. The paradox connects to philosophical debates about the nature of knowledge, about whether there are different kinds of knowledge that cannot be reduced to each other. Propositional knowledge, knowing that something is true, and experiential knowledge, knowing what something is like. And the distinction is illustrated by cases like colour perception. A person who has never seen red but knows all the physical facts about red light, about wavelengths and retinal responses and neural processing, does not know what red looks like, does not have experiential knowledge of redness. And when they see red for the first time, they learn something new. And this suggests that experiential knowledge is distinct from propositional knowledge, cannot be obtained just by knowing facts. And if this is right, then God's omniscience, if it is purely propositional, misses something, misses the experiential dimension. And God does not know what it is like to see red for the first time, does not know what it is like to learn, does not know what ignorance feels like. Visualize the problem as a conflict between two divine attributes: omniscience, which requires always having known everything, and perfect empathy or understanding, which requires knowing what human experiences feel like from the inside. And human experiences include experiences of not knowing, and so perfect understanding seems to require having been ignorant. But omniscience seems to exclude ever being ignorant, and the two attributes pull in opposite directions, and something must give. Either God is not omniscient in the full experiential sense, or God does not fully understand human experience, or the distinction between propositional and experiential knowledge is mistaken, and God can know what ignorance feels like without ever being ignorant, through some superior form of knowledge that encompasses both facts and feelings. One theological response is to argue that God's knowledge is sui generis, is of a different kind than human knowledge, and God knows what ignorance is like, not by experiencing it, but by knowing its nature completely, by understanding all its causes and effects and phenomenal properties, and this understanding is so complete that it counts as knowing what ignorance is like, even though God has never been ignorant. And this response tries to bridge the gap between propositional and experiential knowledge, tries to say that sufficiently complete propositional knowledge includes experiential knowledge, but critics argue that this misses the point, that no amount of knowing facts about an experience captures what the experience is like, that there is an irreducible, subjective aspect that can only be known by having the experience. And so God's propositional knowledge, however complete, does not include experiential knowledge of ignorance. Another response is to embrace kenosis, the theological idea that God voluntarily limits divine attributes. And this view says that God can and does experience ignorance, that in becoming incarnate, in taking human form as Christ, God experienced human limitations, including not knowing things. And the gospel accounts support this, showing Jesus learning, growing in wisdom, not knowing when the end times would come. And this shows that God can experience ignorance without ceasing to be God, that omniscience is not essential to divinity, but is a power that can be set aside. And this resolves the paradox by denying that God is always omniscient, accepting that there are times when God voluntarily limits divine knowledge. But this creates new puzzles about whether a being that is not always omniscient can be called omniscient, and whether divine attributes can be temporary. A third response distinguishes between different kinds of ignorance, between merely not knowing a fact which God never experiences, and the phenomenology of searching for knowledge, the feeling of curiosity and discovery, which God might be able to simulate or understand through analogical reasoning, and God knows what it would be like to be in a state of ignorance, even though God is never actually in such a state. Just as someone who has never been to Mars might know what it would be like through detailed scientific knowledge and imagination, and this response tries to preserve both omniscience and experiential understanding by making experiential knowledge a form of imaginative or counterfactual knowledge. But again, critics argue that simulating or imagining an experience is not the same as having it, that there is a difference between knowing what it would be like and knowing what it is like, and God's simulated ignorance is not real ignorance and does not provide the experiential knowledge that the paradox concerns. The omniscience paradox also raises questions about divine immutability, the claim that God does not change, because if God learns or discovers anything, then God changes, gains knowledge that was previously lacking, and this violates immutability, and so perfect knowledge seems to require having always known everything, never learning, never being surprised, and yet this static, eternal knowledge seems incompatible with understanding temporal beings who do learn and are surprised, and reconciling omniscience and immutability with understanding human experience remains a challenge for classical theology. The paradox extends beyond ignorance to other experiential states. Does God know what it is like to be tempted, to feel desire for something forbidden, to struggle with moral choice? And if God is perfectly good, necessarily good, then God cannot be genuinely tempted, cannot feel the pull of evil, and so there is an aspect of human moral experience that God cannot know from the inside, and this creates distance between divine and human experience, suggests that God's understanding of humanity is necessarily incomplete, necessarily limited by God's perfection, and this is ironic, that God's perfection prevents complete understanding, that to fully know what it is like to be human, God would have to be imperfect, would have to experience weakness and ignorance and temptation, and these are incompatible with divine perfection. Some theologians embrace this limitation, argue that God's knowledge is perfect for a perfect being, but does not include the experiential knowledge of imperfection. And this is not a defect but a feature, a reflection of God's nature. And just as we do not think a perfect circle is defective because it is not a square, we should not think God is defective because God does not know what ignorance feels like, because such knowledge is incompatible with perfection. And the paradox assumes that all knowledge is good and more knowledge is always better, but perhaps some kinds of knowledge are only available through imperfection, and lacking them is not a limitation but a consequence of being perfect. Others reject omniscience entirely, argue that it is an incoherent concept, that complete knowledge is impossible, that there are always things that cannot be known, experiential states that require imperfection, future free choices that are not yet determined, logical truths that exceed any finite or infinite mind's capacity to grasp all at once. And if omniscience is impossible, then God is not omniscient, but this does not diminish God, does not make God less than perfect, because perfection means having all attributes that it is possible to have, not having impossible attributes. And omniscience, like omnipotence, when examined carefully, turns out to be impossible. And so God is not omniscient, but maximally knowledgeable, knows everything that can be known, and this is sufficient for divinity. God stands outside time, knowing all facts, all truths, all possibilities, and yet there is a gap, an experiential gap. God does not know what it feels like to search, to wonder, to be wrong, to learn. And whether this gap is a limitation or a feature remains contested, and the omniscience paradox persists, challenging the coherence of divine attributes, forcing clarification of what knowledge means, what kinds of knowledge exist, and whether complete knowledge is even possible. And the paradox remains unresolved, a permanent fixture in philosophy of religion, a reminder that even the most basic divine attributes, even the claim that God knows everything, conceal complexities and contradictions that philosophy continues to explore. The paradox of choice, why having everything makes us want nothing. A shopper stands in the cereal aisle of a modern supermarket, surrounded by hundreds of options, dozens of brands, each offering multiple varieties, chocolate cereals and fruit cereals and granola and organic options and sugar-free options and high-fiber options. And the shopper came with a simple goal: to buy cereal, but now faces a wall of choices, and minutes pass. Then more minutes, as the shopper reads labels, compares prices, weighs nutritional content against taste preferences, and the simple task becomes exhausting, becomes overwhelming, and eventually the shopper either picks something randomly just to escape the aisle, or leaves without buying anything at all, paralyzed by too many options. And this is the paradox of choice, articulated by psychologist Barry Schwartz. The observation that while having some choice is better than having none, having too many choices can actually make us worse off, can lead to decision paralysis, anxiety, dissatisfaction, and regret. And this paradox challenges the assumption that more freedom and more options always lead to better outcomes, suggests instead that there is an optimal amount of choice beyond which additional options become burdensome rather than beneficial. Imagine living in a world with few choices, a small village where there is one type of bread, one kind of shoe, limited options for occupation and lifestyle, and people generally wear what everyone wears, eat what everyone eats, follow the paths that tradition provides. And this limited choice can feel constraining, can prevent people from finding what truly suits them, can force them into roles and lifestyles that do not fit, but it also simplifies life, reduces the cognitive burden of decision-making, provides clear social scripts and expectations, and people in such societies often report high satisfaction because expectations are managed, because the gap between what they have and what they could have is small. And now contrast this with modern, affluent societies where choice proliferates endlessly, where every decision, from what to eat for breakfast to what career to pursue, involves navigating vast option spaces. And while this freedom allows for personalization, allows people to find exactly what they want, it also creates anxiety, creates the constant question of whether a better option exists, whether the choice made was optimal. And this anxiety erodes satisfaction even when the chosen option is good, because the existence of unchosen alternatives haunts a decision. The paradox operates through several psychological mechanisms. First is decision paralysis. When faced with too many options, the cognitive load of evaluating them becomes overwhelming. And rather than carefully comparing all options, people either make hasty decisions to escape the complexity or defer the decision entirely, avoid choosing at all. And this is why offering more product varieties can sometimes decrease sales, why adding options can reduce rather than increase engagement, because each additional option adds to the burden of decision making, and at some point the burden exceeds the benefit and people opt out. Second is regret and second guessing. When there are many options and you choose one, the existence of all the unchosen options creates opportunity for regret, creates the thought that perhaps one of the other options would have been better, and this regret is stronger when there are more alternatives, because each alternative represents a path not taken, a potential source of better outcomes. And so the chosen option must compete not just with reality, but with imagination, with idealized versions of what the unchosen options might have provided, and actual outcomes rarely exceed these idealized counterfactuals. And so satisfaction decreases even when the choice is good. And this effect is amplified when choices are reversible, when you can change your mind, because reversibility keeps all options perpetually open, prevents commitment, prevents the psychological closure that comes from accepting a decision as final. Third is the escalation of expectations. When there are few options, we expect less. We accept what is available and feel grateful if it is good. But when there are many options, we expect to find exactly what we want, expect the perfect fit, and our standards rise. And this rising threshold means that good outcomes feel merely adequate rather than excellent. And satisfaction depends not on absolute quality, but on the gap between expectations and reality. And more choice raises expectations faster than it improves outcomes. And so, the net effect is decreased satisfaction, despite better products and more freedom. Visualize a graph with number of options on one axis and satisfaction on the other, and the relationship is not linear but inverted U-shaped. Satisfaction rises as options increase from 0 to some moderate number, perhaps 5 or 10, because having some choice allows people to find something that fits their preferences. But beyond that optimal point, satisfaction begins to decline. And at very high numbers of options, satisfaction may even fall below the level experienced with minimal choice, because the cognitive and emotional costs of choosing exceed the benefits of additional options. And this inverted U captures the paradox, shows that more is not always better, that optimization requires moderation, that there is such a thing as too much freedom. The paradox has practical implications for product design, marketing, and policy. Companies that offer too many products may overwhelm customers and reduce sales, while companies that curate their offerings, that limit choice to a manageable set of high-quality options, may increase satisfaction and loyalty. And this is why successful brands often limit their product lines, why Apple offers relatively few models compared to competitors, why some restaurants have short menus. The limitation is not a failure, but a strategy, a recognition that customers benefit from being protected from too much choice, from having the decision space narrowed by experts who have already done the filtering. The paradox also affects personal life and well-being. Modern individuals face an unprecedented number of choices about identity, lifestyle, career, relationships, and consumption. And while this freedom is liberating in principle, in practice it can be exhausting, can create a sense of being overwhelmed, can generate anxiety about missing out on better options, and research shows that people in societies with more choice are not necessarily happier, that reported life satisfaction has not increased proportionally with the explosion of options, and some argue it has decreased, that the paradox of choice contributes to rising rates of anxiety and depression, that the burden of constructing a life from infinite options without clear guidance is a source of modern malaise. One response to the paradox is to adopt satisficing rather than maximizing as a decision strategy. Maximizers seek the best option, the optimal choice, and this requires evaluating all possibilities, comparing exhaustively, and the process is endless because there is always the possibility that a better option exists somewhere. While satisficers set a threshold of good enough and choose the first option that meets that threshold, and satisficers experience less stress, less regret, and higher satisfaction because they commit to good options without torturing themselves about whether better options exist. And embracing satisficing is a way to opt out of the paradox, to limit self-imposed choice burden even when external options are numerous. Another response is to establish routines and defaults, to make decisions once and then follow the decision automatically in the future, to reduce the number of active choices required. And this is why successful people often simplify their lives, wear the same clothes every day, eat the same breakfast, follow the same schedule, not because they lack creativity, but because they recognize that decision-making is a limited resource, that every choice consumes cognitive energy, and preserving that energy for important decisions requires eliminating trivial choices through routinization. A third response is to embrace constraints, to deliberately limit options, to refuse to consider all possibilities, and this might involve setting rules like, I only shop at this store, or I only consider jobs in this city. And these self-imposed constraints reduce the choice space, make decisions more manageable, and paradoxically increase freedom by preventing paralysis, by ensuring that decisions get made rather than deferred indefinitely. And constraints are not limitations on freedom, but conditions for effective exercise of freedom, structures that enable choice rather than preventing it. The shopper stands in the cereal aisle, paralyzed by options, and eventually walks away empty-handed or grabs something arbitrarily, and the experience is repeated across modern life, in career choices and relationship decisions and consumption patterns, and the paradox persists. More choice leading to less satisfaction, more freedom creating more anxiety, And Schwartz's insight remains relevant, challenges the ideology of unlimited choice, suggests that well-being requires moderation, requires protection from too much optionality, and the paradox endures as a reminder that freedom is complex, that having options is valuable, but that value has limits, that beyond a certain point additional options become burdens rather than benefits. And the challenge for individuals and societies is to find the optimal level of choice, the sweet spot where there is enough freedom to allow for genuine self-determination, but not so much that the burden of choosing overwhelms the benefit of having chosen. And the paradox remains a feature of modern affluent societies, a price paid for abundance, and a problem that requires not more choice but wiser choice, not more options but better frameworks for navigating options. And the cereal aisle waits, endless and overwhelming, and the shopper eventually learns to bring a list to decide in advance, to opt out of the paradox by refusing to treat every shopping trip as an opportunity for exhaustive optimization. The manipulation argument, when being programmed feels like choosing. A scientist creates a person in a laboratory, designs their brain molecule by molecule, programs their psychology precisely, installs specific beliefs, desires, values, personality traits, and then releases this person into the world, and the person deliberates about what to do, weighs options, considers consequences, makes decisions based on their reasons, their desires, their values, and all of this psychological processing feels normal from the inside, feels like genuine deliberation, genuine choice, and yet the person's entire psychology was determined by the scientist, was programmed. And so the person's choices are not really their own, not really free, are the scientist's choices implemented through the person's brain, and the person is not responsible for actions that flow from programmed psychology, is more like a puppet than an agent. And this is the manipulation argument against compatibilism. The argument that being determined by natural causes, by genes and environment, is relevantly similar to being determined by manipulation, by programming. And if programmed persons lack free will, then naturally determined persons also lack free will. And since determinism says all persons are naturally determined, all persons lack free will if determinism is true, and compatibilism is false. And this manipulation argument, developed by Dirk Peerboom and others, creates a serious challenge for compatibilist theories, forces compatibilists to explain how natural determination differs from manipulation, how being caused by evolution and upbringing differs from being caused by a neuroscientist. And the argument remains controversial, remains debated, and compatibilists offer various responses. But the challenge persists. Imagine the manipulated person situation. They wake up in the laboratory, memories implanted, personality formed, and they go about their life, make choices, pursue goals, and from their perspective, everything seems normal. They feel like they are choosing freely, feel like their decisions are their own, and yet every thought, every desire, every value was installed by the scientist. And nothing about their psychology is random. Nothing escaped the scientist's control. And now consider whether this person is morally responsible for their actions, whether they deserve praise or blame. And the intuition is no. They are not responsible because their actions flow from programmed psychology, from values and desires they did not choose, that were imposed on them. And responsibility requires that psychology be one's own, not be externally determined. And the manipulated person's psychology is not their own, is the scientist's creation. And so they lack responsibility, lack free will. The manipulation argument proceeds through cases, starts with extreme manipulation, obvious programming, and then gradually moves toward more natural cases, and asks at each stage whether the person is responsible, and the cases are designed to show that there is no relevant difference between manipulation and natural causation, that if manipulation undermines responsibility, then natural determination also undermines responsibility. And the four-case argument, Peerboom's version, goes as follows. In case 1, a person is directly manipulated by scientists who induce specific mental states. In case 2, a person is programmed from birth by scientists who arrange their environment and training. In case 3, a person is determined by their genetic inheritance and upbringing without any intentional manipulation. In case 4, a person is determined by the normal causal processes of a deterministic universe. And Pereboom argues that there is no morally relevant difference between these cases, that if case 1 undermines responsibility, then so do the others. And since case 4 is just determinism, determinism undermines responsibility, and compatibilism is false. Visualize the progression, from direct neural manipulation to genetic engineering to natural upbringing to deterministic causation. And at each stage, the person's psychology is caused by factors beyond their control, factors they did not choose. And the manipulation argument says that the source of causation, whether intentional or natural, does not matter for responsibility. What matters is that the person's psychology was determined by factors beyond their control. And this determination undermines freedom regardless of whether a scientist or nature did the determining. And if we agree that the manipulated person, in case 1, is not responsible, then we must agree that naturally determined persons, in case 4, are also not responsible, and compatibilism, which says determinism is compatible with responsibility, is refuted. Compatibilists respond to the manipulation argument with various strategies. One response distinguishes between manipulation and natural determination, argues that manipulation involves bypassing the person's normal, deliberative processes, involves imposing psychology externally, while natural determination involves the person's psychology developing through normal processes, through learning and experience and interaction with the world. And this difference matters for responsibility, makes naturally determined persons responsible, even though manipulated persons are not. And the manipulation argument fails because it ignores this difference, treats all determination as equivalent when it is not. Another compatibilist response argues that the manipulated person is responsible, challenges the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility. And this response requires biting the bullet, accepting that even persons whose psychology was programmed by scientists are responsible as long as their actions flow from their own deliberation, their own reasons, even if those reasons were installed. And this response preserves compatibilism by denying that manipulation undermines responsibility, by insisting that what matters for responsibility is not the origin of psychology, but its current functional organization. And if the person deliberates and acts on their deliberations, then they are responsible, regardless of how their psychology came to be. A third compatibilist response distinguishes between historical and structural accounts of responsibility, argues that responsibility depends on the structure of the person's psychology, on whether they have the right kind of control mechanisms, the right kind of reflective capacities, not on the history of how that psychology was formed and manipulated. Persons can have the right structure, even if their history is abnormal, and so they are responsible. And the manipulation argument fails because it assumes that history matters when only structure matters, and compatibilism is preserved by adopting a structural rather than historical account of responsibility. Incompatibilists defend the manipulation argument, defend the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility, and argue that compatibilist responses are ad hoc, are motivated by a desire to save compatibilism rather than by principled distinctions, and there is no relevant difference between being determined by a scientist and being determined by genes and environment. Both involve the person's psychology being shaped by factors beyond their control. Both undermine the kind of control required for responsibility, and the manipulation argument succeeds in showing that compatibilism is false, that determination, whether by manipulation or by nature, is inconsistent with freedom, The manipulation argument also raises questions about what responsibility requires, about whether responsibility is historical, depends on how psychology was formed, or structural, depends only on current organization. And this debate is central to understanding free will, to clarifying what kind of control is required for moral responsibility. And the manipulation argument forces this debate into the open, makes it explicit. And even if the argument does not definitively refute compatibilism, it succeeds in challenging compatibilists to articulate their view clearly, to explain what distinguishes responsible from non-responsible agents. The programmed person walks through life, choosing, deliberating, acting, and feeling free. And the question remains whether they are genuinely responsible, whether their choices are truly their own, or whether they are puppets, implementations of the scientist's design. And the manipulation argument uses this person to challenge compatibilism, to question whether natural determination is really different from artificial manipulation, and the argument persists as one of the most powerful challenges to compatibilist theories. A challenge that highlights the difference between feeling free and being free, between subjective experience of choice and objective reality of determination. And the manipulated person remains choosing but programmed, free feeling but determined. And whether such a person is responsible remains contested. And the manipulation argument endures as a permanent challenge to compatibilism, forcing recognition that if determinism is true, then we are all in a sense manipulated, determined by factors beyond our control. And whether this determination undermines responsibility, whether it makes us unfree, remains one of the deepest questions in philosophy of free will. The omnipotence paradox. Can God create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it? A theologian proclaims that God is omnipotent, all-powerful, able to do anything, and this claim is central to many religious traditions. Reflects the idea that God is unlimited, unconstrained, the ultimate being with ultimate power, and yet a simple question reveals a logical puzzle, a challenge to the coherence of omnipotence. And the question asks whether God can create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it. And this question seems innocent, but it creates a dilemma. Because if God can create such a rock, then there is something God cannot do, namely, lift the rock. And so God is not omnipotent. And if God cannot create such a rock, then again, there is something God cannot do, namely, create the unliftable rock. And so again, God is not omnipotent. And either way, omnipotence seems impossible, seems self-contradictory, and this is the omnipotence paradox, also called the stone paradox, a puzzle that has troubled theologians and philosophers for centuries, forcing them to clarify what omnipotence means, what powers an all-powerful being could and could not have, and whether the concept of omnipotence is even coherent. Imagine the scenario concretely. God stands in a cosmic workshop, materials at hand, ready to create, and God decides to make a rock, but not just any rock, a rock so massive, so heavy, so immovable that even God's infinite power cannot lift it. And God sets to work, shaping matter, compressing mass, until the rock is complete. And then God tries to lift it, and the rock does not budge. God pulls and pushes and exerts all divine force, but the rock remains on the ground, unliftable. And this seems to show that God is not omnipotent, because there is something God cannot do, cannot lift this particular rock. And yet if God never creates the rock, if God admits that creating such a rock is impossible, then this also shows God is not omnipotent, because there is something God cannot create. And the paradox presents a forced choice. Neither option preserves omnipotence. And the concept seems to collapse under its own logic. The paradox can be generalized beyond rocks. The question could be whether God can create a task so difficult that God cannot complete it, whether God can create a being so powerful that God cannot control it, whether God can make a rule so binding that God cannot break it, and in each case the same structure emerges. Either God can create the limiting thing, in which case God is limited by it, or God cannot create it, in which case God is limited by the inability to create it. And either way, God's power has boundaries, and omnipotence seems impossible. And this suggests that omnipotence might be an incoherent concept, might not be logically possible, might be like a square circle or a married bachelor, something that sounds meaningful but actually combines contradictory ideas and cannot exist. Theologians and philosophers have developed several responses to the paradox, attempting to show that omnipotence is coherent and that the paradox rests on misunderstandings or ambiguities. One common response is to restrict omnipotence to logically possible tasks, to say that God can do anything that is logically possible but cannot do things that are logically impossible, and creating a rock that an omnipotent being cannot lift is logically impossible, is self-contradictory, because omnipotence includes the ability to lift anything, and so a rock that cannot be lifted by an omnipotent being is a logical impossibility, like a square circle. And God's inability to create logical impossibilities does not limit God's power in any meaningful sense, because logical impossibilities are not real tasks, are not things that could be done. And so excluding them from the scope of omnipotence is not a limitation but a clarification. Visualize omnipotence as a set of powers: the power to create anything logically possible, the power to know anything knowable, the power to do anything doable. And the set does not include impossible things, does not include making square circles or creating married bachelors or lifting unliftable rocks. Because these are not tasks, are not possibilities, are just combinations of words that do not refer to any coherent state of affairs. And just as we do not think a mathematician is limited because they cannot prove that 2 + 2 = 5, we should not think God is limited because God cannot do logically impossible things, because these are not things, are not genuine constraints on power. Another response distinguishes between God's essential attributes and God's contingent choices, and argues that omnipotence means God has the power to do anything consistent with God's nature. And part of God's nature is being omnipotent, and so God cannot create a situation where God lacks omnipotence, because that would contradict God's nature. But this is not a limitation on God's power. It is a feature of what God is. And just as God cannot make God not exist, because God is a necessary being, God cannot make God not omnipotent, because omnipotence is essential to God. And the rock scenario asks God to create a contradiction, to remain omnipotent while becoming not omnipotent, and this is incoherent. And God's inability to do it reflects logical necessity, not weakness. A third response embraces the paradox and argues that it shows omnipotence is paradoxical, is not a coherent concept, and rather than defending omnipotence, we should acknowledge that God's power, while immense, is not literally unlimited, that there are things God cannot do, and this is not a defect in God but a recognition that power, like any concept, has logical limits. And some religious traditions, particularly in Eastern philosophy, are comfortable with divine paradoxes, with the idea that ultimate reality transcends logical categories, and the paradox of omnipotence is just one of many paradoxes that arise when finite human concepts are applied to the infinite divine. The paradox also appears in discussions of free will and divine foreknowledge, because if God knows the future infallibly, then God knows what choices humans will make. And if God knows what choices humans will make, then humans cannot choose otherwise, because if they could, then God's knowledge would be wrong. And so divine omniscience seems to eliminate human free will. And this creates a dilemma similar to the omnipotence paradox. Either God is not omniscient, does not know future free choices, or humans are not free, do not have genuine choice. And both options are unpalatable to many theologians who want to preserve both divine perfection and human freedom. And various solutions have been proposed, involving timeless knowledge, middle knowledge, open theism, but none has won universal acceptance, and the tension remains. The omnipotence paradox reveals that The concept of unlimited power is more complex than it first appears. That power operates within logical and conceptual constraints, and that saying God is all-powerful does not mean God can do literally anything we can describe in words, but only that God can do anything that is genuinely possible, anything that makes sense, and the paradox serves as a test case, forces clarification of what omnipotence means, pushes theologians to be precise about divine attributes, and shows that even the most basic theological claims require careful, philosophical analysis to be made coherent. God stands before the rock, or does not create the rock, and the paradox hangs in the air, a logical puzzle about power and limits, about possibility and coherence, and the answer depends on how omnipotence is defined, on whether logical impossibilities are excluded, on whether God's nature places constraints on divine action, and different traditions answer differently. Some saying God transcends logic, some saying logic constrains even God, and the omnipotence paradox remains, not fully resolved, still debated, still used to challenge and clarify theological concepts, and the rock sits there, hypothetical and impossible, a monument to the difficulties of thinking clearly about ultimate power, about infinite abilities, about what it means to say God can do anything. And the paradox persists, elegant and troubling, a reminder that even divine attributes, even the powers of an unlimited being, must answer to logic, must cohere, must make sense, and that the concept of omnipotence, for all its simplicity, conceals depths and difficulties that philosophy continues to explore. The paradox of analysis, how explaining something makes it meaningless. A philosopher attempts to analyze a concept, to provide a definition that captures its meaning precisely, and suppose the concept is knowledge, and the philosopher proposes that knowledge is justified true belief. And this analysis, if correct, should be informative, should tell us something we did not already know about what knowledge is, should illuminate the concept by breaking it down into simpler components. But here emerges a paradox articulated by C.H. Langford and discussed extensively by G.E. Moore, because if the analysis is correct, then the analysandum, the concept being analysed, and the analysans, the analysis itself, must have the same meaning, must be synonymous, otherwise the analysis would be incorrect, would not capture what knowledge really is. But if they are synonymous, then stating the analysis provides no new information, becomes a tautology, becomes equivalent to saying knowledge is knowledge, which is trivial, tells us nothing. And so the analysis cannot be both correct and informative. If it is correct, then it is trivial. If it is informative, then it is not a genuine analysis, but merely a stipulation or a proposed change of meaning. And this is the paradox of analysis, a puzzle about whether conceptual analysis is even possible, whether we can both correctly identify the meaning of a concept and provide new insight into that concept. Imagine presenting the analysis to someone who understands the concept of knowledge, who uses the word correctly, who can distinguish cases where knowledge is present from cases where it is absent, and you tell them that knowledge is justified true belief. And if they already knew this, if the definition merely makes explicit what was implicit in their understanding, then the analysis is correct but uninformative, tells them nothing new. But if they learn something, if the analysis reveals something they did not already know, then it seems the analysis is changing the concept rather than analysing it, is offering a new concept rather than clarifying the old one. And either way, the analysis fails to do what philosophical analysis is supposed to do, both correctly identify meaning and provide insight. The paradox challenges the entire enterprise of conceptual analysis, challenges the method that has been central to analytic philosophy for over a century, the method of taking ordinary concepts like knowledge, justice, truth, and providing precise definitions. And if the paradox cannot be resolved, then conceptual analysis is either impossible or pointless. Either it cannot be done correctly, or when done correctly, it provides no insight. and this threatens one of philosophy's main methods, forces philosophers to reconsider what they're doing when they offer analyses, what counts as success and whether analysis is discovery or stipulation. Visualize the paradox as a dilemma. On one horn, the analysans and analysandum are synonymous, have the same meaning, and the analysis is correct but trivial, like saying a bachelor is an unmarried man, which is true but uninformative because anyone who understands the word bachelor already knows this. And on the other horn, the analysans and analysandum differ in meaning, and the analysis is informative but incorrect, provides new information but does not capture what the original concept meant. And either way, the analysis fails to achieve the goal of being both correct and informative. And the paradox seems to show that this goal is impossible, that correctness and informativeness are incompatible in conceptual analysis. One response distinguishes between sense and reference, between how a concept is presented and what it refers to, and argues that an analysis can have the same reference as the analysandum while differing in sense, and so the analysis is informative because it presents the concept differently, makes explicit aspects that were implicit even though it refers to the same thing, and the analysis knowledge is justified. True belief is informative because even though knowledge and justified true belief refer to the same set of cases, they present those cases differently, one as a simple concept and the other as a complex structure. And learning the structure is learning something new, even though the reference remains the same. And this response draws on Frege's distinction between sense and reference, uses it to explain how analyses can be both correct and informative. Another response appeals to implicit versus explicit knowledge, argues that competent speakers have implicit understanding of concepts, understand how to use them correctly, but lack explicit understanding, cannot state the definition, and conceptual analysis makes implicit knowledge explicit, converts procedural knowledge into propositional knowledge, and this conversion is informative even though it does not add to what was implicitly known, and the analysis is correct because it captures the implicit understanding and informative because it makes that understanding explicit and available for reflection. And so the paradox dissolves because correctness and informativeness are compatible when we recognize that knowledge comes in implicit and explicit forms. A third response questions whether analyses are meant to be synonymous, argues that philosophical analyses are not claims about linguistic meaning, but claims about the nature of things, about what knowledge really is, about its essential properties, and knowledge is justified. True belief is not a claim about what the word means, but a claim about what knowledge consists in, about its metaphysical structure. And this claim can be informative, even if it is necessarily true, even if knowledge could not be otherwise, because discovering necessary truths is informative. Learning that water is H2O was informative, even though it is necessarily true that water is H2O, and so philosophical analysis is more like scientific discovery than like lexicography, more like finding out what things are than like defining words. And the paradox assumes the wrong model of analysis. The paradox also connects to debates about analyticity and the analytic-synthetic distinction, because if analyses are analytic truths, true in virtue of meaning, then they should be trivial, should be knowable a priori just by understanding the concepts. But many proposed analyses are controversial, are rejected by competent speakers, and this suggests either that analyses are not analytic, or that analyticity is more complex than traditionally thought. And Quine's critique of the analytic-synthetic distinction can be seen as embracing the paradox, as arguing that there are no purely analytic truths, that all statements are revisable, that meaning and fact are not sharply separated, and so philosophical analyses are not discoveries of meaning, but proposals for how to understand concepts, and their value is pragmatic, depends on whether they illuminate, rather than whether they are correct in some absolute sense. The paradox remains unresolved Different philosophers offer different solutions based on different theories of meaning and different conceptions of what philosophical analysis aims to achieve. And the paradox continues to challenge the methodology of analytic philosophy, forces ongoing reflection on what analysis is, what it can accomplish, and whether the goals of correctness and informativeness can be reconciled, or whether philosophy must choose between them. And the concept of knowledge sits waiting for analysis, and the philosopher proposes justified true belief. And the question remains whether this is a discovery or a stipulation, whether it is correct or informative, or neither or both. And the paradox persists, a puzzle about philosophy's methods, about whether conceptual analysis is possible, about the relationship between understanding and articulation, between implicit grasp and explicit formulation, and whether the attempt to make our concepts precise enriches or distorts them, captures their meaning or creates new meanings. And the paradox endures as a permanent challenge to philosophical methodology, a question about whether philosophy can deliver on its promise to analyze and clarify concepts, or whether the very attempt to analyze creates a problem that cannot be solved without giving up either the goal of correctness or the goal of informativeness. And the analysis hangs there, proposed but problematic, informative or correct, but not both, and the paradox remains. The paradox of fiction, why we cry for people who don't exist. A person sits in a dark theatre watching a film, and on the screen a character faces tragedy, loses a loved one, experiences betrayal, suffers deeply, and the person watching feels genuine emotion, feels sadness, feels tears forming, feels the physiological responses of grief. And yet the person knows that what is happening on screen is not real, knows that the characters are fictional, that no one actually died, that the suffering is pretend, is mere actors following a script in front of cameras. And this creates a puzzle because emotions seem to require beliefs, seem to depend on thinking that something is really happening, that genuine harm or loss has occurred. And if you do not believe something is real, then you should not have emotional responses to it. And yet, fiction produces powerful emotions, despite the audience knowing it is fiction. And this is the paradox of fiction, articulated by Colin Radford and others. The question of how we can be moved by what we know to be false, how we can fear for characters we know do not exist, how we can grieve losses we know never happened. And the paradox challenges our understanding of emotion, raises questions about the relationship between belief and feeling, and forces recognition that emotional responses are more complex than simple belief response models suggest. Imagine watching a horror film, a scene where the protagonist is chased by a monster, and your heart races, adrenaline surges, you feel fear, genuine fear, and yet you know you are safe. Know you are sitting in a theatre, know that no monster exists, that the events on screen are fabricated, and if fear requires believing you are in danger, then you should not feel fear, should remain calm, should watch with detachment, but you do not. You respond emotionally, despite knowing the fiction is not real, and this emotional engagement is not a mistake, not a failure of rationality, but is how fiction works, how stories affect us. And the paradox asks how this is possible, how belief and emotion relate when they seem to come apart in cases of fiction. The paradox can be formulated as three inconsistent claims. First, we have emotional responses to fictional characters and events. We cry at sad movies, laugh at comedies, feel suspense in thrillers, and this is undeniable. Second, emotional responses require beliefs about the reality of their objects. You cannot fear something you know does not threaten you, cannot grieve something you know did not happen. Emotions are directed at states of affairs we believe obtain. And third, we do not believe fictional characters and events are real. We know they are fictional, know that no one is actually in danger, that no loss actually occurred. And these three claims are inconsistent. Any two imply the negation of the third, and resolving the paradox requires rejecting or modifying one of them. Visualize the emotional response as a two-stage process. First comes the perception or imagination of a situation, seeing the character in danger, imagining their suffering, and second comes the emotion, the fear or sadness or joy, and normally these two stages are connected through belief. You perceive danger and believe it is real, and this causes fear. But in fiction, the connection is different. You perceive or imagine danger, but do not believe it is real, and yet fear occurs anyway. And the paradox asks what mediates the connection in fiction, if not belief. One response denies the second claim, argues that emotions do not require beliefs, that emotional responses can be triggered by perceptions or imaginings without requiring that we believe what we perceive or imagine is real, and this response treats emotions as more primitive than beliefs, as responses that evolved to deal with immediate situations and that can be activated by representations even when we know those representations are not real. And fiction works by hijacking these emotional systems, by presenting stimuli that trigger emotional responses directly without requiring belief. And so we fear fictional monsters, because our fear system responds to the representation of danger even when we know the danger is fictional. Another response modifies the first claim, argues that the emotions we feel toward fiction are not genuine emotions, but quasi-emotions, pale imitations of real emotions that lack certain components. And when we cry at a movie, we are not really sad, not in the way we would be sad if the events were real, but we are experiencing something similar, a simulation or shadow of sadness. And this quasi-emotion does not require belief, because it is not the full genuine article, and this response preserves the connection between belief and genuine emotion while explaining fiction through a different kind of response that resembles emotion without being emotion. A third response, associated with Kendall Walton, appeals to imaginative engagement, argues that when we engage with fiction, we make believe. We imagine that the fictional events are real, and our emotional responses are responses to what we imagine rather than to what we believe. And imagination can trigger emotional responses without requiring belief, can produce fear and sadness and joy through imagined scenarios. And fiction invites us to imagine certain things, and our emotions follow from these imaginings. And this response treats make-believe as a distinct cognitive mode, different from both belief and mere perception. A mode that can generate emotions without requiring that we believe the imagined content is real. The paradox also raises questions about the function of fiction, about why we engage with fictional narratives, why we subject ourselves to emotions triggered by events we know are not real. And various answers have been proposed. Perhaps fiction allows us to explore possibilities, to experience situations vicariously, to rehearse emotional responses in safe contexts. Perhaps it serves social functions, helps us understand others, builds empathy, creates shared experiences, or perhaps it provides aesthetic pleasure, the enjoyment of well-crafted narratives, regardless of their truth. And understanding why fiction moves us might help explain how it moves us, might reveal the mechanisms that connect fictional representations to emotional responses. The paradox extends beyond fiction to other representational arts, to paintings that depict scenes that never occurred, to music that evokes emotions without representing anything, to imaginative scenarios we generate ourselves when daydreaming or planning. And in all these cases, emotions arise without corresponding beliefs about reality. And this suggests that the relationship between emotion and belief is more flexible than the paradox assumes, that emotions can be triggered in multiple ways, through beliefs about reality, but also through perceptions, imaginings, representations, and stimuli that engage our emotional systems directly. Some philosophers argue that the paradox reveals important truths about the nature of emotion, that emotions are not simply cognitive responses to believed states of affairs, but are complex phenomena involving perception, imagination, physiological arousal, and behavioral dispositions. And these components can dissociate, can come apart, and in fiction, we have the perceptual and imaginative components without the belief component, and this dissociation produces emotional responses that are real but not fully equivalent to emotions directed at reality. And so the paradox is not a problem to solve, but a feature to explain, a demonstration of the complexity of emotional life. The theatre darkens, the film plays, the character suffers, and the audience cries, knowing it is fiction, yet moved nonetheless. And the paradox remains a puzzle about how art affects us, how representation produces emotion, how we can care about what we know does not exist. And the tears are real, even though their object is not. And this strange combination, this ability to be moved by acknowledged fiction, is central to human experience, is what makes stories powerful, makes art meaningful, makes imagination a source of feeling as potent as reality. And the paradox endures, unresolved in the sense that no consensus solution has emerged. No account of emotion in fiction that satisfies all philosophers, only a recognition that fiction moves us, that we respond emotionally to representations, that imagination and emotion are deeply connected, and that the relationship between belief and feeling is more complex than we thought. And the paradox persists as a reminder that human psychology is subtle, that cognitive and emotional systems interact in non-obvious ways, and that the ability to be moved by fiction, far from being a problem or a mistake, is a capacity that enriches life, that allows us to experience more than our immediate circumstances, to feel for others, to explore possibilities, and to find meaning in stories we know are not true. The paradox of free will, why choice seems both real and impossible. A person stands at a crossroads, two paths diverging, and must choose which way to go. And the person deliberates, weighs options, considers consequences, and makes a decision, chooses one path. And this choosing feels free, feels like the person could have chosen otherwise, like the decision was truly up to them, genuinely within their control. And yet the person's decision is the result of brain processes, is caused by prior states of neurons, by chemical reactions, by electrical signals, and these processes are themselves caused by earlier states, by genetics and experience and current circumstances, and the chain of causation extends back through the person's life, through evolution, through the physical history of the universe. And at no point in this causal chain is there a break, a moment where cause gives way to free choice, where determinism is suspended. And if every event has causes, if the present is determined by the past plus the laws of physics, then the person's decision was determined long before the moment of choosing, was inevitable given prior conditions. And the feeling of free choice is an illusion. The decision was never really up to the person, could not have been otherwise. And this creates the paradox of free will, the apparent incompatibility between the subjective experience of freedom and the objective reality of causal determination, between the feeling that we choose and the fact that our choices are caused. And this paradox has troubled philosophers for millennia, generated enormous literature, produced multiple attempted solutions, but never achieved consensus. And the problem persists as one of the central questions in philosophy, ethics, and the nature of human agency. Imagine the person's brain at the moment of decision, neurons firing in specific patterns, dopamine and serotonin modulating activity, and these patterns cause the decision, determine which path is chosen, and the patterns themselves were caused by prior brain states, by sensory inputs, by memories activated, by emotional states, and these prior states had their own causes, and the causal chain is unbroken, and nowhere in this chain is there room for free will, for choices that are not caused, for decisions that could have been different given exactly the same prior conditions. And if determinism is true, if the laws of physics determine everything, then free will seems impossible, seems to be a conceptual confusion, And yet the feeling of freedom persists, and we hold people responsible for their actions, praise and blame them, treat them as if their choices were free. And the legal system, morality, social practices all assume free will, assume that people could have done otherwise. And the paradox is that free will seems both necessary for responsibility and impossible given causation. The paradox generates three main positions: compatibilism, which says free will is compatible with determinism; incompatibilism, which says they are incompatible; and libertarianism, not political libertarianism, but metaphysical libertarianism, which accepts incompatibility and argues that determinism is false, that humans have genuine free will, and different philosophers defend each position with different arguments, and no consensus emerges, and the debate continues, and the paradox remains unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable. And this might reflect a deep feature of human existence, that we cannot escape the feeling of freedom, even if we become convinced intellectually that freedom is impossible, that the first-person perspective of deliberation requires treating ourselves as free even if the third-person perspective of science shows that we are determined. Visualize determinism as a timeline. The state of the universe at one time, plus the laws of physics, determines the state at the next time. And this determination is complete, includes everything, includes brain states and decisions, and the timeline is like a film that has already been recorded, and we are living through it, experiencing events as they unfold. But the sequence is fixed, was fixed by initial conditions billions of years ago, and our decisions as frames in this film are determined by previous frames. And no alternative timeline is possible given the initial conditions and the laws. And if this picture is correct, then the feeling of having options, of being able to choose differently, is illusory. We could not have chosen differently. The decision was already encoded in the prior state of the universe, and we are not free. Compatibilists respond that this picture misunderstands what free will requires, that free will does not require the ability to have chosen differently given exactly the same prior conditions, does not require breaking the causal chain, but only requires that our choices flow from our own desires, values, character, that we are not coerced, not forced, not manipulated, and as long as the person's decision resulted from their own deliberation, their own reasons, they acted freely, even though their deliberation was caused, even though their reasons were determined. And free will is compatible with determinism, because free will is about the source of action, about whether it comes from the agent's own psychology, not about whether it is uncaused. Incompatibilists reject compatibilism, argue that if determinism is true, then everything we do was determined by factors beyond our control. By genetics we did not choose, by environments we did not create, by causal chains that began before we were born. And we are not genuinely responsible for actions that were determined by factors beyond our control. And compatibilist free will is not real freedom, but is a verbal trick, is redefining freedom to make it compatible with determinism and genuine freedom. The kind required for moral responsibility requires that we could have done otherwise, requires that our choices are not determined. And since determinism is probably true, given physics, genuine free will probably does not exist, and moral responsibility is problematic. Libertarians argue that determinism is false, that quantum mechanics shows that the universe is not deterministic, that there is genuine randomness, genuine indeterminacy at the quantum level, and this indeterminacy allows for free will, allows for choices that are not determined by prior states. But critics respond that randomness is not freedom, that random neural processes do not give us control over our actions, do not make us responsible, and adding randomness to determinism does not create free will, creates only determinism plus chance, and neither determination nor chance gives us the control required for responsibility. The paradox of free will also has practical implications for criminal justice, for morality, for how we treat each other, Because if free will is an illusion, then punishment seems unjustified, seems cruel, and blame seems inappropriate, and we should respond to harmful behaviour with rehabilitation or prevention rather than retribution. And yet the practice of holding people responsible seems essential to social life, seems unavoidable even if philosophically problematic. And we continue to blame and praise, punish and reward, as if free will exists, and perhaps this is necessary. Perhaps human social life requires treating people as responsible, even if the metaphysical foundations are shaky. The person stands at the crossroads, deliberates, chooses, and walks down one path, and whether this choice was free remains disputed, remains one of philosophy's hardest questions, and the paradox endures. Free will seems both essential and impossible, both real and illusory, and the tension between these perspectives remains unresolved, and perhaps the tension is permanent, is a feature of human existence that cannot be eliminated, that we must live with the subjective feeling of freedom while recognizing the objective reality of causation, and the paradox of free will persists as a permanent puzzle about human agency, about responsibility, about whether we are authors of our actions or merely characters in a predetermined story. And the question remains open, continues to generate debate, continues to matter for ethics and law and self-understanding. And the crossroads remains, the paths diverge, the choice is made, and whether it was truly free remains one of philosophy's deepest and most enduring questions. The paradox of value, why what we need most costs least. An economist contemplates the nature of value, asks what makes things valuable, what determines worth, and observes a fundamental puzzle that prices seem disconnected from importance, that markets assign high prices to luxuries and low prices to necessities, that goods essential for human flourishing cost little while goods that serve vanity or status cost fortunes. And this is the paradox of value, the broader version of the diamond water paradox, the puzzle that spans across all goods and services. And the paradox asks why healthcare is expensive, while entertainment is cheap in some places and the reverse in others. Why teachers are paid less than entertainers. Why life-saving drugs are affordable in some markets and unaffordable in others. Why the allocation of value by markets seems misaligned with human needs, with moral worth, with social importance. And this paradox has troubled economic thinking since ancient times, has been discussed by philosophers from Aristotle to Marx. And while modern economics offers explanations through supply and demand, through marginal utility, through market equilibrium, the paradox retains moral force, retains the sense that something is wrong, that prices should reflect importance, that markets fail to value correctly, and the paradox of value remains a central challenge for defending market allocation, for justifying price mechanisms, for explaining why efficient markets can produce what seem like perverse valuations. Imagine comparing different goods by their importance to human welfare. And air is essential, sustains life, is necessary for survival, cannot be done without for more than minutes. And yet air is free, has zero price, costs nothing. While gold is non-essential, serves no biological function, is desired only for decoration or a store of value, and yet gold is expensive, costs thousands per ounce, and this comparison illustrates the paradox, shows that necessity and price are inversely related, that the most needed goods are often cheapest and the least needed goods often expensive. And this pattern extends across many goods. Water is cheap, housing varies but is often expensive, healthcare is expensive in many places, education costs are rising, food prices are moderate, while luxuries like jewellery, sports cars, yachts, artwork, all command premium prices. And the pattern suggests that markets value incorrectly, value luxury over necessity, value status over survival. And this creates moral discomfort, creates the sense that market allocation is unjust, is misaligned with human values. The paradox of value demonstrates the tension between exchange value, what markets assign, and use value, what humans need, and Marx emphasized this distinction, argued that capitalism systematically undervalues use value, undervalues goods necessary for life, while overvaluing exchange value, overvaluing goods that serve accumulation. And this misalignment is not accidental, but is structural, is inherent in market systems that allocate based on willingness to pay rather than on need. And those with money can bid up prices of luxuries, while those without cannot bid up prices of necessities. And markets respond to money, not to need. And this explains the paradox. It explains why diamonds are expensive and water cheap. Because those who want diamonds have money to pay high prices, while those who need water cannot afford high prices. And markets clear at prices that balance supply and demand among those with purchasing power, not among all humans with needs. Visualize the paradox as revealing different concepts of value: economic value, defined by market prices determined by supply and demand, and purchasing power, and moral or social value, defined by importance to human welfare, determined by needs and flourishing. And these two concepts diverge, are not aligned. And economic value is amoral, is neutral about what should be valued, reflects only what is valued by those with money to spend, while moral value judges that some goods are more important than others, that necessities matter more than luxuries, that human needs should be prioritized. And the paradox is the gap between these concepts, is the recognition that markets do not track moral value, do not allocate according to importance. And this gap creates the sense that markets are unjust, are inadequate for distributing goods that matter most. One response to the paradox of value is that markets are efficient, are good at allocating resources to maximize satisfaction of preferences weighted by willingness to pay. And while this may not align with moral importance, it is the best available system, is better than alternatives, like central planning, which face information problems and incentive problems. And markets at least respond to decentralized information about preferences, at least allow individuals to make choices. And efficiency does not require tracking moral importance, requires only that resources go to those who value them most as measured by willingness to pay. And this response accepts the paradox, accepts that markets do not and should not track moral value, argues that moral allocation should be achieved through other means, through taxation and redistribution, through public provision of essential goods, through regulation that ensures access to necessities, and markets should be left to allocate efficiently while other institutions address moral concerns. Another response questions whether the paradox is real, argues that necessities actually are valuable, are provided at low cost because markets are efficient at producing them, because competition drives prices down, and the reason necessities are cheap is that we have solved the production problem, have made them abundant, and abundance is good, is the goal. And the paradox mistakes low price for low value, confuses market price with social importance. And in fact, low prices for necessities mean high consumer surplus, mean people benefit greatly from access to cheap necessities. And this is success, not failure. Is markets working well? Not markets failing. And the paradox dissolves once we recognize that low prices for necessities reflect abundance and efficiency rather than lack of value, and high prices for luxuries reflect scarcity and inefficiency rather than high value. A third response embraces the paradox, accepts that markets misallocate, argues that essential goods should not be left to markets, should be provided through public systems, through universal health care, through public education, through subsidized housing, and markets can allocate luxuries, can determine who gets diamonds and yachts. But necessities are different, require different allocation mechanisms, require ensuring universal access regardless of ability to pay. And this social democratic response uses the paradox to argue for limits on markets, for sectors where market allocation is inappropriate, where public provision is necessary, and the paradox becomes an argument for mixed economies, for market allocation in some domains and public allocation in others. The paradox also appears in labour markets, where compensation seems misaligned with social importance, and teachers are paid less than entertainers, nurses less than financiers, social workers less than lawyers, and this pattern suggests that markets undervalue socially important work, undervalue contributions to welfare and education and care, while overvaluing contributions to entertainment and finance. And this creates moral discomfort, creates the sense that labour markets are unjust, and explaining the pattern requires understanding supply and demand for labour, requires recognising that compensation reflects scarcity and productivity as measured by market value, not social importance, and teachers are abundant relative to demand, while CEOs are scarce, and market productivity of CEOs as measured by profit contribution exceeds that of teachers, and these factors determine compensation, not social importance. And this explains the pattern but does not eliminate the moral concern, does not resolve the sense that something is wrong with a system that pays entertainers more than educators. Some argue that the paradox of value reveals limits of price as measure of value, reveals that not everything important can be priced, that some goods resist commodification, that markets are appropriate for some goods and inappropriate for others, and market prices are useful for allocating produced commodities but are inadequate for allocating access to health, education, safety, justice, and these latter goods require different allocation mechanisms, require treating them as rights or entitlements rather than as commodities to be purchased. And the paradox supports this view, supports the idea that markets have limits, that not everything should be for sale, that some forms of value resist market logic. The necessities remain cheap, the luxuries remain expensive, and the paradox persists. Prices diverge from importance, exchange value diverges from use value, markets allocate without regard to need, and the pattern continues, and the paradox of value endures as a permanent feature of market systems, endures as a moral challenge to market allocation, and resolving the tension requires either accepting that markets are amoral, are efficient but not just, and supplementing markets with institutions that ensure access to necessities, or rejecting markets for essential goods, replacing market allocation with public provision. And the paradox remains unresolved and troubling, showing that what we need most costs least, that prices do not track importance, that markets value incorrectly from a moral perspective, even if correctly from an economic perspective, and the paradox endures. The paradox of the court, when a student's promise becomes impossible to keep. An ancient story tells of a law teacher named Protagoras and his student Euathlus, and they make an agreement. The student is too poor to pay tuition up front, and so they agree that the student will pay the teacher after winning his first court case, and the teacher provides instruction, teaches the student rhetoric and law and argumentation, and the student completes his training, becomes skilled in legal reasoning, but then the student never takes a case, never appears in court, never wins anything, and years pass and the teacher has not been paid, and finally the teacher sues the student, takes him to court to demand payment. And now the paradox emerges because the case creates a logical impossibility, a situation where no judgment can be coherent, where the law contradicts itself. And this is the paradox of the court, also called Protagoras' paradox, a puzzle about legal reasoning, contracts, and self-reference that has no satisfactory solution. Imagine the trial. The teacher presents his case, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will order the student to pay, and the student will be legally obligated to pay the agreed tuition, and second, that if he loses the lawsuit, then the student has won his first case, and according to the original agreement, the student must pay after winning his first case, and so, either way, the student must pay, whether the court rules for the teacher or for the student. The contract ensures payment, and this argument seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot avoid payment, that filing the lawsuit was a clever move, that forces the student into a position where any outcome requires payment. But now the student, trained in rhetoric by the teacher himself, presents a counter-argument of equal force, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will rule in his favour, and he will not be legally obligated to pay, and second that if he loses the lawsuit, then he has not won his first case, and according to the original agreement, he only pays after winning his first case, and so either way, he does not have to pay. Whether the court rules for him or against him, the contract protects him from payment. And this argument also seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot be forced to pay, that the lawsuit was a mistake that creates a situation where no outcome requires payment. Visualize the judge sitting in court, listening to both arguments, recognizing that both are logically valid, both follow from the premises, both reach opposite conclusions, and the judge must render a verdict, must decide whether the student pays or does not pay. But any decision seems arbitrary, seems to violate logic, because if the judge rules for the teacher, then the student wins his first case and does not have to pay, according to the contract. And if the judge rules for the student, then the student loses and does have to pay, according to the contract. And so, the judge's decision determines the opposite of what it declares, creates a self-contradicting outcome, and the law becomes incoherent, and the case cannot be decided without paradox. The paradox reveals a problem with self-referential contracts, contracts whose terms depend on the outcome of litigation about those very terms, because such contracts create loops, create situations where the contract's fulfillment depends on whether the contract is enforced, and whether it is enforced depends on whether it is fulfilled. And this circular dependency generates contradictions, makes it impossible to apply the law consistently, and the paradox shows that some contracts, even if agreed to voluntarily by competent parties, are legally unenforceable. Not because they violate public policy or lack consideration, but because they are logically incoherent, because no court can implement them without contradiction. One proposed resolution is to distinguish between two different questions: the question of whether the student owes the teacher money according to the contract, and the question of whether the court should order the student to pay, and these are separate issues. The contract might create an obligation that the court nonetheless refuses to enforce, and the court could rule in favour of the student on the narrow question of whether the lawsuit succeeds, while still recognising that the student has a moral obligation under the contract to pay once he wins his first case elsewhere. And this resolution separates legal enforcement from contractual obligation, allows both arguments to be partially correct. The teacher is right that the student owes money, the student is right that the court should not order payment, and the paradox dissolves because the two contradictory outcomes apply to different questions. Another resolution appeals to temporal priority, arguing that the lawsuit itself does not count as the student's first case for purposes of the contract, because the contract was made before the lawsuit, and counting the lawsuit as the first case would mean the contract refers to itself, which creates the paradox. And so the court should interpret the contract as referring to the first case other than the lawsuit about the contract itself. And under this interpretation, if the teacher wins the lawsuit, the student must pay, because the lawsuit is not the first case that triggers payment. And if the student wins the lawsuit, the student does not pay, because the student still has not won a first case other than this one. And the paradox is resolved by excluding self-referential applications of the contract terms. A third resolution argues that the contract is void, because it is impossible to perform, because there is no possible world where the terms are satisfied without contradiction, and impossible contracts are unenforceable, and so the judge should declare the contract void and dismiss the case, leaving the student with no legal obligation, but perhaps a moral obligation to pay the teacher for services rendered. And this resolution sacrifices the contract to preserve logical coherence, treats the paradox as showing that the agreement was fatally flawed from the beginning. The paradox also raises questions about the limits of freedom of contract, about whether parties should be allowed to make any agreement they choose, or whether law should refuse to enforce agreements that are logically incoherent. And most legal systems recognize some limits, refuse to enforce contracts that are impossible, illegal, or against public policy. And the paradox of the court suggests adding logical coherence as another limit, another requirement for enforceability. And this means that contracting parties cannot create obligations that are self-referentially paradoxical, cannot make agreements whose terms depend on their own enforcement in ways that generate contradictions. The paradox has modern analogues in cases involving conditional gifts and trusts, where someone leaves property to another person on condition that the recipient perform some act. And if the act is defined in terms of legal outcomes about the gift itself, then paradoxes can arise, similar to the ancient case of the teacher and student, and courts have developed various doctrines to handle these cases, generally interpreting conditions to avoid self-reference, to prevent the kind of logical loops that the paradox of the court exemplifies. The courtroom stands empty, the ancient case unresolved, the judge unable to render coherent judgment, and the paradox remains a teaching tool in logic and law, an illustration of how self-reference creates problems, how circular definitions generate contradictions, and how even voluntary agreements between competent parties can be unenforceable if their structure is logically incoherent. And Protagoras and Euathlus remain frozen in their dispute, both right and both wrong, both entitled to payment and entitled to refuse payment. And the paradox persists as a reminder that logic constrains law, that not everything that can be agreed to can be enforced, and that self-reference, whether in contracts or in statements or in rules, is a source of paradox that must be handled carefully to avoid contradiction. The paradox of the ravens, yet another formulation of Hempel's problem. The paradox appears under multiple names because different philosophers have formulated it independently or emphasized different aspects. And the paradox of the ravens is essentially identical to the paradox of confirmation and to the raven paradox, all referring to Hempel's discovery that observing non-black non-ravens logically confirms the hypothesis that all ravens are black. And this formulation emphasizes the ravens themselves, emphasizes that the hypothesis is about a specific class of objects, ravens, and yet evidence can come from observing completely different objects, apples and shoes and clouds, and the paradoxical nature lies in this disconnect between what the hypothesis is about and what confirms it, between the subject matter and the evidence, and calling it the paradox of the ravens highlights this strange relationship, makes explicit that ravens are the subject of the hypothesis, but need not be the subject of confirming observations. The multiplicity of names reflects the paradox's importance, its centrality to philosophy of science, because a problem this fundamental is rediscovered repeatedly, is approached from different angles, and each formulation brings slightly different emphasis, highlights different aspects of the puzzle, and some formulations focus on confirmation theory, on the formal logic of evidence, while others focus on scientific practice, on what scientists actually do when testing hypotheses, and still others focus on intuitions, on the clash between logical conclusions and common sense judgments. And all these perspectives are valuable, all contribute to understanding the paradox, and the proliferation of names is a sign of the paradox's richness, its ability to raise questions at multiple levels, from technical issues in confirmation theory to broad questions about scientific method. The paradox also connects to debates about Bayesian versus frequentist approaches to statistics and inference, because Bayesians have a ready answer to the paradox, can explain using Bayes' theorem why red apples confirm that all ravens are black, but provide only negligible confirmation, while frequentists struggle more, find it harder to explain the asymmetry between observing ravens and observing non-ravens. And this has led some philosophers to see the raven paradox as evidence for Bayesianism, as showing that Bayesian methods are better equipped to handle confirmation than classical approaches, though others argue that the paradox is not decisive, that various approaches can accommodate it with appropriate modifications. The paradox remains a standard topic in philosophy curricula, a problem that every student encounters. And despite its age, despite being formulated in the 1940s, it continues to generate discussion, continues to appear in new papers and books, because it is simple enough to explain quickly, deep enough to sustain extended analysis, and challenging enough that no solution is universally accepted. And this combination makes it pedagogically valuable and philosophically important, a paradox that serves both as an introduction to philosophy of science and as a topic for advanced research. The ravens circle overhead, black against the sky, and each sighting confirms what we already believed, that ravens are black, and elsewhere apples sit in bowls, red and green and yellow, and logic says these two are evidence about ravens, and the paradox persists, a permanent feature of confirmation theory, a problem that every account of scientific reasoning must address. And the paradox endures under its many names, always the same underlying puzzle, always the same challenge to explain how evidence works, what confirms hypotheses, and why common sense and formal logic sometimes diverge. And the paradox of the ravens remains, waiting for each new generation of philosophers to confront it, to propose solutions, to argue about confirmation, and to recognize that even basic concepts in science conceal philosophical depths that resist easy resolution. The lottery paradox. Imagine a fair lottery with 1 million tickets, and exactly one ticket will win, and you have not yet learned which ticket won. And now consider each individual ticket. Ticket number 1 has a 1 in a million chance of winning, which means it has a 999,999 in a million chance of losing. And this is overwhelmingly probable, so probable that it seems rational to believe that ticket 1 will not win. And the same reasoning applies to ticket 2, ticket 3, and every other ticket. Each has a minuscule chance of winning and an enormous chance of losing, and so it seems rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win. But now a problem emerges. If you believe that ticket 1 will not win, and you believe that ticket 2 will not win, and you believe this for each of the million tickets, then it seems you should believe that no ticket will win, because belief is generally thought to be closed under conjunction. If you believe P and you believe Q, then you should believe P and Q. And by repeated application of this principle, if you believe of each ticket that it will not win, then you should believe that none of them will win. But you also know with certainty that exactly one ticket will win. This is a stipulated fact of the lottery, and so you believe both that no ticket will win and that some ticket will win. And these beliefs are contradictory, and so you hold contradictory beliefs, which seems paradigmatically irrational. Yet each individual belief, the belief that ticket 1 will not win, the belief that ticket 2 will not win, and so on, seems perfectly rational, justified by the overwhelming probability. And so the lottery paradox forces a choice between accepting that rational belief can be inconsistent, rejecting closure of belief under conjunction, or denying that high probability is sufficient for rational belief. The paradox was articulated by Henry Kaiberg in the 1960s, and it has generated an enormous literature in epistemology with various proposed solutions and no clear consensus. And the paradox reveals deep tensions in our ordinary thinking about belief, knowledge, probability, and rationality. Tensions that cannot be easily resolved without giving up some cherished principles or intuitions. One response is to reject closure, to argue that rational belief is not closed under conjunction, that you can rationally believe each of many propositions without rationally believing all of them together, especially when the propositions are probabilistic and the number of them is large. And this response aligns with the observation that the probability of a conjunction is the product of the probabilities of the conjuncts. And so even if each ticket has only a 1 in a million chance of winning, the probability that at least one ticket wins is certainty. And so there is a gap between the high probability of each individual proposition and the low probability of their conjunction. And this gap justifies believing each individual proposition while not believing their conjunction. Another response is to raise the threshold for rational belief, to argue that high probability is not sufficient for belief, that belief requires something stronger, perhaps near certainty or probability, above some higher threshold, like 99% or 99.9%. And if we raise the threshold high enough, then it will no longer be rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win, because the probability that it will not win, while high, is not high enough to meet the raised threshold. And so the paradox dissolves, because the initial premise that it is rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win is rejected. A third response distinguishes between degrees of belief, or credence, and full belief, arguing that we should assign high credence to the proposition that ticket 1 will not win, perhaps 99.9999%, but we should not fully believe it. And full belief is reserved for propositions that meet a higher standard, perhaps certainty or near certainty. And this response preserves the intuition that high probability matters for rationality, while avoiding the paradox by denying that high probability justifies full belief. Still another response embraces a kind of rational inconsistency, arguing that in certain situations it is rational to hold inconsistent beliefs, that consistency is not an absolute requirement of rationality, that the world is complex and uncertain, and our beliefs must reflect that uncertainty, even if it means tolerating some inconsistency. And this response aligns with the preface paradox, where an author rationally believes each claim in a book while rationally believing that not. All the claims are true, and both paradoxes suggest that closure of belief under conjunction is too strong a requirement, that it demands a kind of logical perfection that finite agents in uncertain environments cannot achieve. The lottery paradox also connects to debates about the nature of knowledge, because it seems clear that you do not know that ticket 1 will not win, even though you have excellent evidence for believing it. And this suggests that knowledge requires something more than justified true belief, perhaps a safety condition. The requirement that in nearby possible worlds where you believe PP is true, and in the lottery case there are nearby worlds where the lottery is run fairly and ticket 1 wins, in which your belief that ticket 1 will not win is false, and so your belief fails the safety condition and does not constitute knowledge, even if it happens to be true. The paradox has practical implications as well, because we constantly make decisions based on beliefs that have high but not maximal probability. We believe that the plane will not crash, that the medicine will work, that the bridge will not collapse, and in each case there is a small probability that our belief is false. Yet we act on these beliefs. We board the plane, take the medicine, cross the bridge, and if we refuse to believe or act on anything less than certainty, we would be paralyzed, unable to function in a world of uncertainty. And so, the lottery paradox is not merely an abstract puzzle, but a reflection of the epistemic situation we constantly face, the need to navigate between skepticism and credulity, between demanding too much certainty and accepting too little, between the logical ideal of perfect consistency and the practical necessity of acting on incomplete information. The million tickets sit in the urn, one will win, the others will lose, and reason seems to say both that we should believe of each that it will lose, and that we should not believe that all will lose. And this contradiction, or apparent contradiction, has no easy resolution, no solution that preserves all intuitions and principles. And so the paradox remains a permanent challenge to theories of rational belief, a puzzle that forces philosophers to clarify what they mean by belief, by rationality, by justification, and to acknowledge that our ordinary concepts, when pressed to their limits, reveal inconsistencies and tensions that may be ineliminable features of finite cognition rather than problems to be solved. And the lottery continues, the tickets are drawn, one wins, the others lose, And we believe what we must believe, what rationality seems to demand, even when those beliefs, taken together, lead to contradiction. And the paradox endures, a monument to the gap between logical perfection and epistemic reality, between what we ought to believe in principle and what we must believe in practice. The Monty Hall problem. A game show host presents 3 doors. Behind one is a valuable prize, a car perhaps, and behind the other 2 are less desirable outcomes, goats or some other consolation, and the contestant chooses a door, say, door number 1, but before the chosen door is opened, the host, who knows what is behind each door, opens one of the other doors, revealing a goat, and now 2 doors remain closed. The one the contestant originally chose, and one other, and the host offers a choice, stick with the original selection or switch to the other unopened door, and the question that has baffled and frustrated countless people is simple. Does it matter? Is there an advantage to switching? And the answer, counterintuitive as it seems, is yes. Switching doubles the probability of winning, changing the odds from 1 in 3 to 2 in 3. And this result violates most people's intuitions. Seems wrong? Feels like it cannot be right? Yet it is mathematically certain. And this is the Monty Hall problem, named after the host of the American television game show Let's Make a Deal, a puzzle, improbability that reveals how poorly human intuition handles conditional probability and how easily we can be misled by seemingly simple scenarios. The reasoning behind the correct answer goes as follows. When the contestant first chooses a door, the probability that the prize is behind that door is 1 in 3, and the probability that it is behind one of the other 2 doors is 2 in 3. And this much is uncontroversial. But when the host opens one of the other doors and reveals a goat, showing that the prize is not behind that door, the probabilities do not redistribute evenly among the remaining doors. The original choice still has a 1 in 3 probability of being correct because the host's action did not change the fact that the contestant's initial choice was made with 1 in 3 odds. But the other unopened door now has a 2 in 3 probability because the 2 in 3 chance that was distributed across the 2 unchosen doors is now concentrated in the single remaining door, and so switching to that door doubles the chance of winning. The intuition that misleads most people is the idea that once one door is opened and eliminated, there are 2 doors left, and the prize is equally likely to be behind either, giving a 50-50 chance regardless of whether you switch. But this reasoning ignores the information provided by the host's action, the fact that the host deliberately chose to open a door with a goat. And this deliberate choice is not random, it is constrained by knowledge. The host cannot open the door with the prize and will not open the door the contestant chose. And so the host's action provides information that updates the probabilities in a non-obvious way. A useful way to see why switching is advantageous is to imagine a version of the game with 1,000,000 doors. The contestant chooses one door, which has a 1 in a million chance of having the prize, and then the host opens 999,998 of the other doors, all showing goats, leaving only the contestant's original choice and one other door. And now it seems clear that the contestant's original choice, made with 1 in a million odds, is almost certainly wrong. And the remaining door, the one the host carefully avoided opening, is almost certainly the one with the prize, and switching gives a 999,999 in a million chance of winning. And the same principle applies with 3 doors, just with less dramatic numbers. The Monty Hall problem has been a source of controversy and heated debate, even among mathematicians and statisticians. And when Marilyn Vos Savant, a columnist known for her high IQ, published the correct answer in her magazine column in 1990, she received thousands of letters, many from PhD holders and professionals, insisting she was wrong. And the controversy revealed how deeply counterintuitive the solution is, how resistant people are to accepting it even when presented with mathematical proof. And this resistance reflects broader features of human cognition. The tendency to rely on heuristics and intuitions that work well in most everyday situations, but fail in probabilistic scenarios involving conditional information. The problem also illustrates the importance of conditioning in probability, the fact that probabilities must be updated in light of new information, and that the way information is acquired matters. The host's knowledge and deliberate choice of which door to open is crucial to the solution. If the host opened a door randomly and happened to reveal a goat, then the probabilities would indeed be 50-50. But because the host knows and deliberately avoids the prize door, the situation is different. And this distinction between random and informed selection is subtle and easy to miss. The Monty Hall problem has applications beyond game shows. It appears in medical testing, in legal reasoning, in machine learning, anywhere that probabilities must be updated based on partial information. And understanding the logic of the Monty Hall problem helps clarify how to reason correctly in these more consequential contexts, how to avoid fallacies, how to properly incorporate evidence into probability assessments. The problem also raises questions about the psychology of probability, about why people find certain probabilistic reasoning so difficult. And experiments have shown that even after being told the correct answer and shown simulations that demonstrate it, many people remain skeptical, unable to shake the intuition that switching makes no difference. And this persistence of false intuition, despite evidence, suggests that probabilistic thinking is not natural to humans, that we evolved in environments where simple heuristics like equiprobability were sufficient, and that the kind of careful conditional reasoning required by the Monty Hall problem is a learned skill that requires training and practice. The doors stand closed, one hides the prize, the host knows which. The contestant chooses. The host opens a door, reveals a goat, and offers the choice. And the decision, which seems inconsequential, which feels like a coin flip, is actually a test of probabilistic reasoning, a puzzle that most people get wrong, that defies intuition, that reveals the gap between how we think probability works and how it actually works. And the Monty Hall problem endures, a staple of probability courses, a cautionary tale about trusting intuition, a reminder that the world is full of situations where the obvious answer is wrong, where careful analysis reveals unexpected structure, where what seems like chance is actually determined by hidden information, and the contestant who switches, who overcomes intuition and follows the mathematics, walks away with the prize twice as often, and the contestant who sticks with the original choice, trusting gut instinct, wins only a third of the time. And the difference, the doubling of odds, is not a trick or a gimmick, but a genuine feature of how conditional probability operates, and the problem persists, puzzling new generations, frustrating those who encounter it, illuminating those who understand it. A small puzzle with large implications. A game show scenario that contains lessons about reasoning, evidence, and the limits of human intuition. The origination paradox, why you cannot create yourself. A philosopher asks where free will comes from. What makes a choice truly free, truly yours? And the answer seems to require that you be the ultimate source of your choices, that your decisions originate with you rather than being caused by factors beyond your control. And this origination, this ultimate sourcehood, seems necessary for responsibility, because if your choices are caused by factors you did not create, by genes you did not choose, by environments you did not design, by prior causes that reach back before your birth, then how are you responsible for those choices? How are they truly yours? And yet origination seems impossible, seems to require that you create yourself, that you choose your own character before you have a character to make choices with. And this is the origination paradox, the problem that free will seems to require ultimate origination, ultimate sourcehood, being the first cause of your actions, but such origination is impossible, requires creating yourself from nothing, requires existing before you exist to make the choices that create you. And this impossibility suggests that free will, understood as requiring ultimate origination, is impossible, is an incoherent concept, and responsibility is problematic. And this paradox has driven many philosophers to conclude that free will, in the strong libertarian sense, does not exist, cannot exist, and the most we can have is a weaker compatibilist freedom that does not require ultimate origination. Imagine trying to be the ultimate source of your actions, trying to take complete responsibility for what you do, and you trace back the causes of your action. Your action was caused by your decision. Your decision was caused by your desires and beliefs. Your desires and beliefs were caused by your experiences and your innate psychology. Your innate psychology was caused by your genes and early development. Your genes were caused by your parents, and the causal chain extends back before your existence. And at no point in this chain did you create the causes. At no point did you originate the factors that shaped you. And so you are not the ultimate source of your actions. You are a link in a causal chain that extends beyond you. And if responsibility requires ultimate origination, then you are not responsible because you did not originate yourself, did not create the character from which your choices flow. The origination paradox can be stated as an impossibility argument. To be ultimately responsible for an action, you must be ultimately responsible for how you are, for your character, your values, your psychology, because your action flows from how you are, and to be ultimately responsible for how you are. You must have chosen to be that way, but to choose to be a certain way, you must already have some character, some values, some psychology to make the choice with, and this prior character must itself have been chosen if you're to be ultimately responsible for it. And this leads to an infinite regress. You must have chosen your character. Before choosing your character, must have existed before you existed to create yourself. And this is impossible. And so ultimate responsibility, ultimate origination is impossible. And if free will requires it, then free will is impossible. Visualize the regress to be responsible for action. A, you must be responsible for character C that caused A, and to be responsible for C, you must be responsible for earlier character CE that caused C, and to be responsible for C, you must be responsible for even earlier character C, and so on infinitely. And the regress cannot be completed, cannot be grounded, because there is no first character that you chose, no original act of self-creation. And so the chain of responsibility has no beginning, hangs unsupported, and ultimate responsibility collapses. And with it collapses free will understood as requiring ultimate origination. This argument, developed by Galen Strawson and others, is meant to show that libertarian free will understood as requiring ultimate sourcehood, is impossible, is incoherent. And this drives the debate toward compatibilism, toward the view that free will does not require ultimate origination, but only requires that actions flow from the agent's own psychology, from their desires and values, even if those desires and values were themselves caused by factors beyond the agent's control. And compatibilism avoids the origination paradox by weakening the requirements for freedom, by denying that ultimate origination is necessary. One response to the origination paradox accepts it, accepts that ultimate responsibility is impossible, and embraces the conclusion that no one is truly responsible in the ultimate sense. And this view, sometimes called hard incompatibilism, denies both that we have libertarian free will and that compatibilist freedom is sufficient for genuine responsibility. And moral responsibility is an illusion, is a concept that cannot be sustained once we recognize the impossibility of ultimate origination, and we should replace responsibility with other concepts, with forward-looking considerations about consequences and prevention rather than backward-looking considerations about desert and blame. Another response argues that ultimate origination is not necessary for responsibility, that responsibility requires only proximate origination, being the proximate cause of action, the immediate source. And as long as your action flows from your own deliberation, your own character, you are responsible, even if your character was shaped by prior causes, even if you are not the ultimate source. And proximate origination is sufficient for the kind of responsibility that matters for ethics and law. And the origination paradox shows only that ultimate responsibility is impossible, not that ordinary responsibility is impossible, and we should not let the impossible standard of ultimate origination undermine the possible standard of proximate origination. A third response from agent causation theories argues that persons are uncaused causes, are agents who can initiate causal chains without being caused to initiate them. And agent causation is a special kind of causation, different from event causation, where events cause events and agents, as substances have the power to cause events without being caused to exercise that power. And this avoids the regress because the agent does not need to cause themselves, does not need prior character to act, but can act directly as an uncaused cause. And this preserves ultimate origination by making agents first causes. But critics argue that agent causation is mysterious, unexplained, involves a kind of causation that seems inconsistent with naturalism, seems like magic, and the theory creates more problems than it solves. The origination paradox also connects to debates about moral luck, about whether we can be responsible for factors beyond our control, because the paradox shows that if we trace back far enough, everything is beyond our control, everything is luck, is the product of factors we did not choose, and if we cannot be responsible for luck, then we cannot be responsible for anything. And this conclusion, while following from the paradox, seems too extreme, seems to eliminate responsibility entirely. And this drives some philosophers to accept moral luck, to accept that we can be responsible for actions that depend on factors beyond our control. That responsibility does not require eliminating luck, but only requires certain kinds of control, certain kinds of connection between agent and action. The philosopher asks where you came from, how you became the person you are, and the answer traces back through causes, through genes and upbringing and choices and experiences. And none of these origins were ultimately under your control. None were self-created, and so you are not self-caused, are not self-created, are not the ultimate origination of yourself. And if responsibility requires self-creation, then you are not responsible, and the origination paradox stands as a permanent challenge to libertarian theories of free will, shows that ultimate origination is impossible, shows that we cannot be the uncaused first causes of ourselves, and whether this impossibility undermines all responsibility or only ultimate responsibility remains contested, and the paradox persists, a challenge to the idea that we are truly the authors of our actions, truly the originators of our choices, and the causal chain extends back, and you stand in the middle, caused by the past, causing the future, and where you came from. Who created you? The answer is no one. You emerged from causes, were shaped by forces, and the origination was not yours, was nature's, was the universe's, and whether this makes you unfree, makes responsibility impossible, remains one of the deepest questions in philosophy of free will, and the origination paradox endures, impossible to solve, impossible to escape, a permanent reminder that self-creation is impossible, and ultimate origination is a fantasy, and what we are left with is proximate origination, being the immediate cause of actions, being the link through which causes flow, and whether this is enough for freedom remains the central question, and the paradox stands, stark and unavoidable, showing that we did not create ourselves, cannot create ourselves, and yet must live and choose and be responsible somehow.